Hello, this is Sarah Hood, your friendly librarian. In this video, I'm going to talk about verifying author credibility and verifying publisher or source credibility. Now, this video is a bit long, but you might not need to watch all of it. You can use the table of contents to skip to the parts you'd like to watch, and you'll do that by clicking on either the little white caret at the bottom of your screen or the diagonal right-facing arrow. And if you find it helpful, you can also increase the narration speed. Now, you may have to move your cursor in order to see these tools. Okay, let's get started. When we're looking for information, sometimes we're not particularly concerned about where that information is coming from or the credibility of the source. Sometimes we just want a great coffee cake recipe or some ideas for throwing a surprise party. But when it comes to school, our job, or something important in our personal lives, it matters where our information comes from. Knowing how to verify both author and source credibility is an important skill because it affects the information we consume. So let's start with author credibility. How you may choose to initially go about this could depend on what type of source you're looking at. Let's start with a peer-reviewed journal article you might come across in one of the library's databases. For a review of what peer-reviewed means, check out this video on SFCC Library's YouTube channel called Peer Review. Typically, a peer-reviewed article will prominently display the credentials and/or institutional affiliations of an author or group of authors. Sometimes this information is right next to or underneath the author's name, but sometimes it's at the bottom of the first page. I've even occasionally seen it listed at the very end of an article. If it's not prominently displayed, you'll want to be sure and do your due diligence to find that information by scrolling through the article. If you've searched and that information is not there at all, it could mean that the article might not, in fact, be peer-reviewed, but this isn't necessarily a deal breaker, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the author is not a well-qualified expert. It just means you'll need to employ another tactic to find out about them. So another thing you can try is to click on the article's title to get into the detail record, and then click on the author's name to see if we have anything else they've published. Doing this could shed some light on how well published they are, which in turn could shed light on their area and level of expertise. But keep in mind, SFCC Library is a community college library as opposed to a library at a large research university, so we might not have access to everything that an author has published. So this is a great time to transition into talking about other methods of verifying author credibility, whether you learned of those authors through the library databases or from other sources, such as the open web. Another way you could look to see what an author has published is to check Google Scholar by going to scholar.google.com. You can plug the author's name in and see what comes up. This can often give you a good idea about their level of credibility and expertise. But sometimes, especially with common first and/or last names, it can be hard to discern your author's work. So you may want to add some keywords that reflect the area of research you believe that author specializes in. But even then, sometimes Google Scholar will fetch results from multiple authors who share either the first name or the last. This can sometimes make the search results difficult to interpret and discern. However, one workaround for that is using what's called proximity searching. You'll type the author's first name, then the word around, in all caps, followed immediately, without a space, by parentheses, inside which you'll put the number 3. This will ensure that both the first and last names are not separated by any more than 3 words. In other words, they'll be relatively close together, thus increasing the likelihood, in theory at least, that the results contain what you're looking for. A really nice feature of Google Scholar is that it tells you how many other authors have cited that particular authors. Underneath the article will be a cited by link with a number next to it, which you can click on to see what other articles and authors have used that particular article. A higher cited by number increases the likelihood that the author is indeed credible. But regular Google can be very helpful as well. As you can probably imagine, plugging in the author's name could be very helpful, but try adding some of these words as well. Bio or biography, official website, a few words or a phrase that briefly summarize their area of expertise, or the institution or organization with which they're affiliated. Adding in these terms will go a long way towards zeroing in on results that will help you to more quickly determine the credibility of that author. Keep in mind, though, that especially with common names, you could get results that might muddy the waters a bit. Are Emily Thelwell, the Honorary Research Fellow, and Emily Thelwell, the bartender, two different people? Probably. But be sure to check out and vet each result just to make sure. While many authors don't have an official website of their own, many have a LinkedIn page like we see here. Keep in mind, though, that author websites and LinkedIn pages are self-curated, which means that the content is controlled completely by them, which in turn means that you would likely only see good, positive things on those websites. However, an organization or institution's website is more likely to present information about that person in a more objective way. Here, we're at the University of Warwick's website, as you can see by the .edu embedded within the website's URL. We can see and verify that Emily Thelwell is in fact associated with this university, and we can also see her two publications on this page. And while she doesn't have her PhD at this point in time, the fact that she is a graduate student who is also a research fellow lets us know that she possesses a high level of education. Which brings me to my next point. Let's talk briefly about various levels of educational credentials and what they really mean. Once a person graduates from high school, if they choose to continue their formal education, whether that's immediately after high school or sometime later, they can choose to pursue an associate's degree or a baccalaureate degree, commonly called a bachelor's degree. When pursuing an associate's or bachelor's degree, students will usually take core curriculum or gen ed classes such as basic college level math or composition and writing. Students will also learn how to search for, identify, gather, and critically evaluate the research of others. However, students are generally not required by their college or university to produce and publish original primary research of their own. Associate's degrees generally take 1 to 2 years of study to complete and can often be completed in a community college setting. Bachelor's degrees typically take about 4 years of study and are usually completed at a 4-year institution, such as a university. In addition to the aforementioned gen ed classes, students seeking a bachelor's degree will also complete a comprehensive program of discipline-intensive coursework before graduating, giving them, in most cases but not all, a higher level of expertise than an associate's degree typically would. Once a bachelor's degree is complete, a person can gain even further, more specialized expertise if they choose to pursue a master's degree. Master's degrees typically take about 2 years of full-time study to complete and, like bachelor's degrees, are completed through a university. Students are expected to engage in a level of research that is not only more intensive and focused than a bachelor's degree setting, but is also more self-directed. Depending on their area of study, they may also be expected to produce primary original research, such as studies and experiments. These students will work closely and intensively with their advisors and other program mentors to align their research with their academic and career goals. And depending on those goals, students may be encouraged, if not actually required, to publish their research findings. Again, depending on their area of study, students may also be required to participate in an activity commonly called a thesis defense, in which a panel of academic faculty and advisors engage the student in an intensive question and answer discussion and debate of that student's research, thus establishing that student's high level of expertise. And finally, there's the doctorate degree, or PhD. This degree can take anywhere from a few to several years to complete, and, like a master's degree, it's done through a university. The PhD student, often referred to as a candidate, will be engaged in a highly intensive and rigorous research program throughout the duration of their studies. They are typically expected to participate in a combination, or sometimes even all, of the following activities: conducting original primary research, publishing that research in the form of, for example, a book or peer-reviewed journal articles, teaching coursework to bachelor's and/or master's degree-seeking students, presenting at professional conferences, and being active in professional organizations and societies. Upon completion of their studies, many PhD graduates go on to teach at university, and still others go on to occupy leadership roles in both the private and public sectors. Now, each of these degrees has many abbreviation variations, but they generally start with the first letter of the degree type, with the exception of the PhD. Usually those with a PhD will either have doctor in front of their name or PhD after their name. It can be hard to make sense of the alphabet soup you might come across when looking at an author's credentials, especially if they hold multiple degrees, but when in doubt, you can always Google what the letters mean. Additionally, it should also be noted that there are two other educational credentials, the license and the certificate, usually denoted with an L or a C, that a person can acquire at any point in their educational career. In fact, for some fields, one or both of these may even be required by industry, state, or federal mandates. Before we leave this subtopic, there's one final thing that should be acknowledged, and that is that there are other knowledge systems and ways of knowing that traditionally have not been recognized in formal educational settings. An example of this might be the personal and specialized knowledge that a tribal leader has acquired throughout his or her life. Say you are gathering information about how the availability of water on a nearby reservation has changed over time and the impact of those changes. Yes, an empirical study conducted by an environmental scientist would be valuable, but that scientist will not have the experiential and lived knowledge of that tribal leader who has not only communicated extensively with members of their own community, but very likely also communicated with other key figures outside their community as well. That kind of authority could be invaluable to your research. The reason knowing this is so important is because authority is both constructed and contextual. It's constructed in the sense that various communities may recognize different types of authority, and it's contextual in the sense that the information need may help to determine the level of authority required. So yes, a person's educational credentials are important, but so are other knowledge systems. As a student, part of the research process is learning to discern which forms of knowledge authority can and should take precedent over other forms in your particular research situation. Finally, there are two other things I'd recommend trying when verifying author credibility. These two tactics are especially helpful if your source comes from the open web. One is to rest your cursor over the author's name to see if it's hyperlinked. If so, you can click through to see what other material they've written. How extensively have they written about that topic? Does it seem to be an area of expertise for them? That can help you gauge their level of authority on the topic. And bonus, you might even be taken to their bio as well. The second thing is, believe it or not, check out Wikipedia. Obviously, not every author will have their own Wikipedia entry, but if they do, Wikipedia is a great place to get tipped off to the good, the bad, and the ugly about them. But here's the catch. If you see something in the Wikipedia entry that you haven't already been able to verify through other reliable means and sources, be sure to do that. Most Wikipedia entries have a reference citation number next to just about every piece of information. You can click that reference citation number and be taken to that particular citation at the end of the article, which is usually hyperlinked so that you can access the source itself. Okay, let's talk about verifying publisher and source credibility. Again, we'll start with a peer-reviewed article in the library database. Remember, you can click on the title of the article and get taken into that detail record for that article. Here you'll find tons of bibliographic information about the article, including information about the source in which it was published. Most of the time, that source of information, in this case a journal called Modern Psychological Studies, will be hyperlinked, so you can click on it, and you'll be taken to a page that has information about that journal. Specifically, the publication type, the subject it specializes in, a description of that journal, the publisher's website in case you wish to find out additional information about the publisher, and a yes or no on whether or not that publication is, in fact, a peer-reviewed publication. Knowing all of this can be super helpful in determining the credibility of the publication. But what if you're on the open web? Probably the quickest and easiest thing you can start out with is to see what you can find out about that publisher or organization from their website. Let's say you searched Google and came across this link, an article called Animal Assisted Therapy: Best Practices for College Counseling. It looks promising, so you click on it. After reading the article and vetting the authors, you decide you really like the article, but you want to do your due diligence and verify the organization as well. First of all, we need to make sure we understand who the publisher or organization is. In this example, they make it pretty clear at the top of the page, which is a good sign. You could either Google the ACA Knowledge Center or go to the website specified here, counseling.org/knowledge center/vistas, and check them out, which we'll do in a moment. But what if none of that information was there? No problem. Browser URL to the rescue. Just copy the URL and paste it into another browser or tab, but you'll delete all of the URL except for the main basic part of it. In other words, you want just the homepage URL so that all you have left is this, in this case, counseling.org. So here we are at the counseling.org website. You want to look for an About Us link or something similar. Fortunately, we're able to find it very easily. It's along the top, but sometimes it will be down at the bottom of the page. When we click on it, plenty of information comes up that will tell me important things about this organization, such as their history, their mission and strategic plan, their governance and bylaws. I can click on any of those, and even if I only skim the contents of those pages, it would likely be enough to let me know if this is a professional, well-established organization. But what if a website doesn't have an About Us? Well, that might not necessarily be a total deal breaker in terms of credibility, but it is a red flag. In that case, you can try to find a Contact Us page, which could be at the top or the bottom of the main page. Sometimes that will have information about the website or organization as well, such as staff contact information. This can be valuable for learning who is responsible for the website's content. But if you click on About Us and all you get is some basic form where you're asked to put in all your personal information, it's probably time to find another source. What this means is not only is that site unwilling to be transparent about who they are expecting you to give them your personal information. That's not a fair trade at all. Furthermore, you could be putting your personal and digital identity at risk. So, unless the publisher provides full, verifiable contact information, including email address on their journal site, it's probably best to move on. There's one final thing that should be noted. Individual people aren't the only ones who want to put their best foot forward. Publishers and organizations want to do that as well. So it's important to keep in mind that you likely won't come across anything negative on a publisher's or organization's website. So another thing you can do is, just like with our author previously, you can Google that publisher or organization. Scroll through the results. What are others saying about that publisher or organization? Have they been involved in controversies or scandals? Now, this part of your verification process may take more than a few minutes because if you do see something questionable that comes up, you'll need to investigate it in order to make sure that the claim is valid and not just coming from only one or two sources or from a fringe or a nefarious source. So allow yourself some time for this. To help with this, you can click on News at the top of your Google results list, and that should bring up anything newsworthy pretty quickly. Yet another thing you can do is, you guessed it, check out Wikipedia. But remember, you'll want to use the same approach that you took with your author's Wikipedia entry. If you see something overly negative or positive, or that doesn't line up with information you've already come across, use those reference citation numbers to get access to the sources that are supposedly making that claim. There's one last thing I want to mention, and that's media bias charts and websites. Media bias charts can be super helpful for getting an idea of whether or not and to what degree a media outlet might be biased. A high degree of bias, be it left or right-leaning bias, can and often does affect the veracity and factual reporting of a media outlet. So if the publisher or organization you're researching is to be found on one of those charts, it might be worth looking at. Now, the reason I've saved this for last is because not all publishers and organizations can be found on these media bias charts and websites. Keep in mind that these charts tend to deal strictly with news media and reporting outlets. The three most commonly used media bias websites are mediabiasfactcheck.com, allsides.com, and adfontusmedia.com. Each site has its own unique take on how to search for an outlet or organization and how they choose to visually present that outlet or organization's bias and factual reporting ratings. A note of caution though, media bias charts are super interesting to look at, but they are only a tool and are only as good as the creators and analysts who build and maintain them. Now, with that having been said, I will say these media bias rating websites are pretty transparent about their methodology, in other words, how they go about rating for bias, factual reporting, veracity, etc. And as I've mentioned previously, transparency is a very good sign. So feel free to consult these media bias websites. Just know that if you do, my recommendation would be to search all three of them to see if your chosen publisher, media outlet, or organization is listed in order to get a sense of whether or not all three sites render a similar rating. They don't have to be identical, but if one website's rating is way different than the other two, I'd be skeptical of that. And that's it. Thanks for sticking with me, and don't hesitate to reach out with any questions you may have. You can reach out to me directly at sarah.hood@sfcc.edu or to the library's general email, which we check every day. That's library@sfcc.edu.